Welcome back to Coffee with Sarge. Grab yourself a cup of coffee and pull up a seat here at booth 7. You know, some of the best conversations I've had with drivers didn't start with somebody asking me what they should do. Sometimes they already did it, and now they're trying to figure out whether they made the right decision. That's exactly what happened with the driver who sat down across from me not too long ago. He hadn't been there 30 seconds when he looked at me and said,
"Sarge, I think I made a mistake."
I took a drink of coffee and asked him, "What'd you do?" And that's when the story came out. He'd been with his previous company a little over 2 years. For most of that time, things weren't bad. Not perfect, but not bad. He knew his dispatcher. His dispatcher knew him. He knew which customers were going to take forever to unload him. He knew which lanes usually had decent freight. He knew how the company operated. And most weeks, he knew roughly what his paycheck was going to look like. But then he had a couple of bad weeks. Freight slowed down. He sat more than he normally did. One paycheck came in lighter than he expected. Then he and his dispatcher got into it over a load. Nothing major, just one of those disagreements that gets bigger the longer you sit in the truck thinking about it. And that's something anybody who's spent enough time behind the wheel understands. You can get pretty aggravated sitting by yourself staring through a windshield. Well, right about then, another opportunity came along. And on paper, it looked better. More money, better miles, better home time, newer equipment. Everything he was frustrated about at his current company seemed better somewhere else. So he made the decision, he turned in the truck and left. Now he'd been with the new company about a month, and that's why he was sitting across from me at booth 7. He told me, "Sarge, this isn't anything like I thought it was going to be." So I asked him what was different. Turns out the pay wasn't exactly what he pictured. The money he'd heard about was possible, but he wasn't getting the miles he'd expected. The home time sounded great when he was talking about the job, but there were details he hadn't really asked about. The equipment was newer, but newer equipment didn't mean much when he was sitting without a load. And then he said something that caught my attention. He said, "I never thought I'd say this, but I actually miss my old dispatcher." I laughed. I said, "The same dispatcher you couldn't wait to get away from?" He laughed too. "Yeah, that one." And that's when I asked him the question I really wanted answered. I said, "When you left that company, were you running toward something better, or were you just running away from a bad couple of weeks?" He didn't answer right away, and usually when somebody doesn't answer a question like that, they already know the answer. Finally, he said, "I guess I was pretty mad when I quit." There it was. The new company wasn't necessarily terrible, and the old company wasn't necessarily great. The problem was that he'd made a long-term career decision based on a short-term frustration. I told him something I've seen happen to drivers for years. A bad week can make a pretty decent trucking job look terrible, and another opportunity showing up during that bad week can look a whole lot better than it really is. Especially when you're angry. Because when you're frustrated, you don't compare everything. You compare the things you're mad about. If your miles are bad this week, you hear more miles. If you're fighting with dispatch, you hear better communication. If you missed home time, you hear more home time. And pretty soon you're comparing the worst week at your current company to the best promises of another one. That's not a fair comparison. Now, I made sure he understood something. I'm not telling drivers to stay somewhere they're miserable. Sometimes leaving absolutely is the right move. If the job no longer fits your family, if the money consistently isn't working, if you're being treated badly, if the operation changed, or you've simply outgrown the opportunity, then maybe it's time to go. There's nothing wrong with making a career move, but make sure you're making a career decision, not an emotional reaction. There's a difference. Before you turn in those keys, give yourself enough time to cool down and look at the whole picture. Look at 6 months, not 6 days. Ask yourself what's actually wrong. Ask whether it can be fixed. And most importantly, ask what you're actually gaining by leaving. The driver looked at me and finally asked, "So what do I do now? Should I call my old company and try to go back?" I told him, "That's not the first decision you need to make." He looked confused. I said, "You spent the last month comparing this company to the one you left. Stop doing that. Give this job an honest look. Figure out whether it can work. Talk to the people you're working with. Learn the freight, learn the system. Find out what a normal month actually looks like before deciding that this was another mistake." Because the worst thing he could do now was get frustrated again and jump to company number 3, then company number 4. And 6 months later, he's sitting at another truck stop telling somebody, "I think I made a mistake." At some point, you've got to stop the truck long enough to figure out where you're actually trying to go. Before he left booth 7, I told him one last thing. A bad week can make a good job look terrible. And the right sales pitch at the right moment can make another job look perfect. Neither one may be true. So when you're thinking about making a change, don't make the decision when you're angry. Don't make it because of one dispatcher. Don't make it because of one paycheck. And don't make it because somebody promised you greener grass on the other side of the fence. Step back. Look at the whole picture. Then decide what's best for your career, your family, and your future. Because changing trucking companies is easy. Building a career takes a little more patience. Something to think about over your next cup of coffee. Drive safe, make good decisions, and I'll see you at the next truck stop.